mighty phantoms of the evening sky. To whom do these celestial steeds belong? When you appear to us like gods on high, what brings you here to mystify?
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Get ready today for a trip on discovering truth through a maze of disinformation and official shenanigans. This is all covered in what should be considered as a textbook on how to conduct a scientific expedition on getting to the truth of a matter. The book is X Descending, and the author is Chris Lambright, and it is my honor to introduce him as our guest today. Welcome to the show, Chris. Thank you for taking the time to being here.
Thanks very much. I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, that's okay. Your book basically, just to simplify things, describes your investigation into two films, one of them from Paul Bennewitz and the other from Ray Stanford. Both of them captured objects that were unidentified and therefore UFOs. And I love the subtitle of your book. Two extraordinary films reveal the lies, the deception, and truth about unidentified flying objects. Great way to put it.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that.
And this journey must have taken you years. This investigation is so deep and so thorough. Whatever got you started and what kept you motivated on this?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I'm like so many other people who've had a long-running interest in this, and of course, information seems to be slow coming out for most people who take the path the same way that I started out. But I guess my real interest began right after college and went on for a few years after that. I was fortunate enough to meet a number of people, a few of them who were already into the subject, and opened some doors, introduced me to the right people. But part of it, I think, along the way, if I have any kind of a intuitive benefit at all, it's being able to sense where there's some grain of truth. It's that gut feeling you get when you know there's something more to this, and at the same time, I'll pick up the phone and call and find out for myself. That's what led me into the situation with Paul Bennewitz. That's what led me to meet Ray Stanford. But it's something that I would hope everyone should do, is do not take everything at face value. If it matters that much, go find out, because very often what you will find is a lot of the cream at the top turns into junk, but the core underneath it remains, and that's the part where the real phenomenon lies. And that's exactly what happened with the Paul Bennewitz case. It's what happened sitting in Ray Stanford's living room when I saw the first pictures from the film that I discuss in the book. You will know this is something seriously real here. And in the case of both of them, in particular Paul Bennewitz's, but of course with Leek Mirabeau having seen Ray's film later on, it becomes very clear that the people in the know behind the scenes, whether it's the Air Force or science in the other cases, they recognize this just as well. And quite often, in the case of Paul Bennewitz, will go to extreme ends to make sure that it doesn't get off the reservation, so to speak, even though to this day now it has, although many years later in the case of the Bennewitz film, but things are still developing with Ray. But it's been a long process for sure.
Well, a lot of the audience is familiar with the Paul Bennewitz story, not so much with Ray Stanford, but I was wondering, for those who are not familiar, could you just give us a sort of a brief summary of what they discovered with their films?
With which film? With both of them?
Both definitely. But certainly Paul Bennewitz, I think, he's been so discredited for so many years and certainly had such a tragic end. His is truly a cautionary tale, and so perhaps we could get into that a bit.
Yes, yeah, it is. In fact, it's why I make the point that any doubts about whether in this particular case it began with AFOSI, although I have serious feelings that it extended way beyond them. I mean, the final control of the phenomena can't exist solely within a small group at Kirtland Air Force Base, for example. But in the case of Paul Bennewitz, any doubts about whether the government, so to speak, and I say that in general terms, would take steps to quash information on this subject is moot after the case of Paul Bennewitz. One thing that a lot of people have brought up that I think needs to be, and I'm aware of this, it's something seriously to think about, is the difference between the Paul Bennewitz case and anyone else, let's just say, who happens to take films of objects out in the in the public, is he took them over their highly sensitive reservation, the Sandia Military Reservation at Kirtland Air Force Base. In fact, over the Manzano nuclear weapon storage area. So, in fact, he caught them with their hands in the cookie jar, if you want to put it that way, but these things were down on the grounds of a very sensitive military installation, which means somebody there would have had some explaining to do. Whether they knew they were there or whether they didn't, either way you go, it wouldn't be good. And so I suspect that had a lot to do with why the effort was put on to suppress the information about what he had, and to, at least in the case of Paul Bennewitz, make darn sure that anybody who came and began to ask questions would see the mud in the water and wash their hands of it. And I almost did that myself, but it was because I called him on the phone, and when I got to talking, of course, a lot of the things that he was saying throughout, by the middle of the 1980s especially, but after that, a lot of it sounded bizarre.
Yeah.
And if you go and look at how much was being fed into him, notably by people he trusted, people he would have assumed he should be able to trust, if the people around you are all telling you things and you don't know what to think, of course, he began to try to incorporate that into his own scheme of what was going on, and so much of what he was saying did sound bizarre. But when I asked, well, what did you call the Air Force for to begin with? I mean, what makes a person pick up the phone and call the Air Force? Then it became clear that he said, it was the first films that he took off of his roof. And at that time, I knew nothing of those films. And clearly, almost no one else is really fully aware that he took those films long before he ever called the Air Force, before they knew he was on the roof. So, but once he did, as far as I'm concerned, once he called him and they knew what he had, all bets are off. In other words, it's difficult to trust anything that came out afterwards, because, as I asked him one time, didn't you think he kind of let the cat out of the bag when he called them and told them what he had? But I think anybody who sees the images in the book will know very clear that what he got are not just little lights. I mean, he actually had an 8mm film camera, a Hasselblad with a 250mm lens, another camera on a telescope pointed out there. And it was not just him. His wife was on the roof with him at least once and watched the same things he saw. So it was very clear that he had something. He had the goods, and he had it in their backyard. And what's curious to me is, to this day, you have everyone who's out and around Disclosure Project, a lot of people claiming, let's go get the government to tell us what's going on. And here is a case with names of people that are still alive. Doty, his supervisors, other people. You could get your congressman to go right down the line and bring these people in and ask questions, and you might at least find some truth of what was going on, especially since Doty has admitted to a lot of what his involvement was. But nobody goes that route. I mean, nobody decides to pick. You find a loose thread and you start pulling that. But even so, his case, I think, had all of that effect on him because of the fact that he filmed it over a military installation. And if the truth came out and people saw those questions, exactly what I just suggested would have happened back then. People would have been called into account. So the job was to make sure to defuse, as Bill Moore put it, to defuse Paul Bennewitz, stuff him full of as much disinformation as they could, so that no one would pay too much attention to him.
Well, that was a major point I think you wanted to make, that if intelligence agency or the government is involved, civilian researchers cannot afford to be naive. And it's almost a direct quote from your book, if they hope to get to the truth.
And I think it's a point to make that if this is as significant as it is, they wouldn't be ignoring it. Just because we think Project Blue Book was over with back in the late 60s, they would not be ignoring it to this day. And now with the technology that's coming out with iPhones, cameras everywhere, communication being instantaneous, they would have to keep track on what the public was aware of and what the public was saying. I mean, we do the same thing to every other country, but in this particular case, the easiest way to do that would be to tie in to the groups in some ways. That's one of the things that I have no direct evidence of it, but there's been plenty of suspicion of that all the way back from APRO. There's plenty of suspicion of it. I've had my own suspicions of it with some of the groups that are around. That the major groups, because to this day you'll see that when most people want to report a sighting, invariably there's only two places that they go to. And if I was wanting to keep tabs on what was going on, I'd have some kind of inroads into those groups. Then I don't have to be publicly seen to be doing anything at all.
Well, there was also that big discussion of Bigelow's involvement with the Mutual UFO Network. That got to be very suspicious to the point where actually both groups sort of separated. It was interesting.
Well, I make that comment. If you notice in the book, I make a comment that, and I've never been a member of MUFON, but and so I'm just saying, but I've known plenty of people who were, that even back in the 80s, I was in a meeting at the Dallas MUFON group when they had become painfully aware of the fact that many, if not most, of the best cases that were going to MUFON back then never made it into the journal. And, of course, they were stunned to learn why that was. And now we find out to this day, if you've ever gone, and I've had experience of my own on occasion, to go and look through the MUFON database, and there are ways to search for things, but you'll find some things are not there. And, of course, in the case of James Carrion, who found out after the fact, there was some big confusion about what was going on and anyway, I don't want to get into all of that, but I do know for a fact, and one point, since you mentioned it, I would like to make is, I think people who report sightings need to tell everybody, report it everywhere, because I've had personal experience with at least a couple of cases that were very telling, and one of them that I thought may very well look like one of the objects that's in the book. But when I contacted the person at MUFON to ask, is there any way I could at least get in touch with this witness to either get a better copy of the photograph? No, you can't do it. Well, can you give my email address to the witness? Since the witness reported it, I presume they want to get it out there so that whoever might be interested could maybe help them do something with it. No, they would not even give my email address to the witness. So I'm afraid there's a lot of information that gets black-holed. You know, people who report it, the investigators report it and don't realize it's never going anywhere else, and the witnesses who report it, nobody else outside of MUFON can get their hands on it. By the way, I have a case that was reported to MUFON. And I did finally find the witness, a lady in Connecticut, who had taken a film. Everybody's familiar with the Salida, Colorado case where the gentleman stood outside and took a picture of what presumably might have been a mothership, something way up there in the sky. And it's been all around for a number of years. This case in Connecticut is far more clear than that, and I wouldn't hesitate to say that it may very well be the same type of object. But she reported it to MUFON, and they immediately wrote it off as a contrail. But if you look at it, I'll send you a picture of it. If you look at one of the pictures, this is not. But, of course, you can't get to those cases to even investigate them, and I wish MUFON would change that. Let me just put it that way. I wish they would give more access.
Well, it's a good hint, though, for anyone that does have a sighting, just to broadcast it as widely as possible.
Yes.
Okay. Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking to Chris Lambright. He is the author of X Descending. We're on 1160 WVNJ. As always, your thoughts, your opinions matter. It's very important, so please let us know what you think by posting it on AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you can go to Amazon for a Kindle version of this book, X Descending by Chris Lambright. It's a very important book. It's a very good primer for those of you just starting out. It will show you how to investigate, and it's an important book. So I hope you get it. I'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today is Mr. Chris Lambright. He is the author of X Descending, a Kindle book available through Amazon. This book involves UFO research, government involvement, counterintelligence operations, and most of them are against the civilians that they are sworn to protect. So if you're one of those civilians, let us know. Post your thoughts now, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. So I guess perhaps in a way the more interesting film would have been Ray Stanford, since that was actually looked into. And as he said, ufology research can bear fruit. It really, they got something out of it with Leek Mirabeau.
I agree. I do agree.
And I think the audience would like to know exactly what it was that he filmed and what happened after that.
I could give you the details. I don't know exactly what he filmed,
okay.
but I think the evidence that the one thing. Oh, and by the way, let me make one thing.
Sure.
Someone who might want a other than Kindle version of my book can go to my website, xspublishing.com, where you can get an EPUB or a PDF. So it is available, or the iBook store, you can get an EPUB version from there as well.
Okay.
But needless to say, in the reason, of course, that I use these two films in my book, for my purposes, was because they both, through Benowitz being offered a grant to the Air Force through the Air Force Weapons Lab at the time, which became the Air Force Research Lab, Mirabeau, who had seen Ray Stanford's film as well, eventually did get a grant through the Air Force Research Lab's Propulsion Directorate to do some work on his light craft. To me, I thought that was highly unusual that both of these gentlemen were, in the case of Benowitz, at least offered one, although they turned it down later on. But needless to say, the Ray Stanford film is, I agree, perhaps the most significant one because it is still ongoing, so to speak. The issue is still alive. But Ray took those films in 1985. Actually, we're not far off of the anniversary of it, which I believe it was October 5th, 1985, in Corpus Christi. And without going into the story of how it occurred, it's described in the book. But this was a procession of objects that came in just almost right over the coastline. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they came in more or less from kind of overland, so to speak, along, vaguely parallel to the coast. But almost when they were overhead, they then turned and went on up into the sky. And he wasn't the only witness. He was there with his two children. There was another group, I think another man and his woman and their daughter, an older daughter, on the same pier at a place called Emerald Bay down in Corpus Christi. But this procession of objects seems to be pulsing some type of beam forward. And the most curious thing, when I first saw this, the thing everyone would recognize, and that made me recognize Mirabeau's work, is that these objects were not traveling horizontally like a frisbee floating. These were on edge, what I say pancaked into the wind, meaning the center axis of radial symmetry. They're on edge, flying faced in the direction of travel. My first thought was not a very aerodynamic way to fly at all. But when it became clear that there's something going on, a beam of some sort is being pulsed straight down the center line out in front, even I at the time thought this beam must be doing something, because obviously it doesn't look very aerodynamic. But this was one of, I believe, 6 or 7 of the same type of objects. And the last one may have been the same one, but it was traveling in some very unusual mode. But needless to say, these would come along, and as one of them reached almost overhead, it would turn and angle on up into the sky. And the others would come along, and Ray had carried a camera with him, an 8mm camera. Back in those days, when I first met him, it was clear to me that he carried that camera everywhere. I mean, he had a backpack, never had it, never was without it. But he's told me how when his children pointed the objects out, he almost dropped that camera into the water and pulled it out and started filming, and ran out of film after the first 4. So obviously there's a substantial amount of film of at least 4 of these objects. And in the last 20 years since I've known Ray, and especially since the computers became kind of home devices, and he and I have spent a lot of time. I don't have anywhere as much time in it as Ray has, obviously, but analyzing and enhancing these images and trying to pull out the details, of what's there. But when I first saw the film, of course, I knew, immediately that image of this thing on edge was in my mind. And it was a few years later, 1993, I believe, that back in the day, if anybody's familiar, when we were all on dial-up modems, that instead of Google groups and Yahoo groups, there were these listservs or mailing lists where you could subscribe to groups. It was all text mode, and whatever. But one of them was called the Skunk Works Digest, and I began to just follow that simply because it was aviation enthusiasts. And Ray and I had talked, and I realized, we better be on top of what we can do if you expect to be able to recognize the difference between what we might call a UFO and something, some technology of our own. But one night I read a report about an experiment that had been done by a gentleman at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. And it sounded very familiar, the idea of using an energy beam to actually mitigate shock waves, to move the atmosphere around. And when I went to the site and read the article and looked at the image, here is a picture through the small window of a hypersonic shock tunnel, like a wind tunnel, but for hypersonic speeds. of what looked like a discus, a small disc standing on edge with a spike. At the time he was using a physical, like a welder spike, like a birthday candle. One candle stuck out of the middle of it. And when the shock wave came down the tube and the energy was applied to that spike, the tip end would basically explode, plasma, for example. And you could see the atmosphere moving right out of the way, going basically around the edge of the disk. And wow, that stocked me, because when I saw that picture, I thought, that's amazingly like what Ray has on film, of these objects doing, obviously in 1985, something we didn't have the technology to do. And when I called Ray and told him, boy, sounds like somebody may have gotten into your files or something, but let me read you this. And I mispronounced the professor's name the first time, I think, and Ray said, oh, that's Lake Marabou. Here, he was at my house a couple of years ago looking at my film. And I thought, holy cow. So as I read the whole thing and realized he went back and took what he could glean from just seeing the film and did some experiments, did some tests with it to see if he could find that, at least prove that point, that using directed energy would actually be able to, by using directed energy on front of your vehicle, you could telegraph, so to speak, to the atmosphere ahead that to move out of the way. You could create a low-density corridor, a low-density bubble, so to speak, and you're basically flying along, your drag goes to almost nothing. And subsequently, plenty of experiments have been done showing that this happens. It's now coined as a directed energy air spike, and all of the ideas for how this could be done since then go to either perhaps using a beam of microwave energy or some kind of energy reflected from some projector up in space. Obviously, we don't have the technology yet to do what Ray Stanford caught on film being done by 6 or 7 objects back in 1985.
And that's the point, exactly, that those objects had the technology then that is just being developed now. So whose technology was it back then?
Exactly. That's why in my book, you will notice I never once make the claim for aliens or ETs. I do say Occam's razor may not cut so cleanly, but that's exactly my point. I mean, what Paul Benowitz saw, it's impossible to say who was flying or who built them, even though if you look, you will see it is not conventional. But in the case of what Ray Stanford had, you mentioned at the beginning that it's taken many years for this. And it was never my goal to write this book. I had no plan until the day I sat down to write it out of frustration to write this particular book. But it's been a great thing that over the last 10 to 15 years, it also meant there was plenty of research that I could go back and see how things developed since Marabou's first experiment and what's been said afterwards. And now there's plenty of evidence, a body of evidence written by well-known scientists, NASA and otherwise, to show that this is a great idea. It's a brilliant concept, but we don't have the technology to do it yet. In other words, it's one that in the future will pay off, but we can't do it. So who built what Ray got on film?
Well, that was his comment, too, that UFO research can pay off. But we'll get back to some more of this. We have to take another quick break. Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking to Chris Lambright. He is the author of X Descending. We're on 1160 WVNJ. We'd really love to know what you think. Let us know by posting your thoughts now at AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you really should pick up this book. And, Chris, it's not just on Amazon. It's also iBooks and also on your website, I believe. The title is X Descending, and it's by Chris Lambright, Lambright. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today, Mr. Chris Lambright, is the author of X Descending. The book involves UFO research, government involvement, counterintelligence, and just a whole bunch of really interesting information. It's an excellent example of how to investigate and just try to glean some truth out of a morass of facts. So we'd like to know what you think. Post your comments and your thoughts now at AtlanticCoastUFO.com. After the show, I would encourage you to get a hold of this book by Chris Lambright, X Descending. And Chris, again, how do they get a copy of that? I know Amazon and Kindle, and
yes, Amazon has the Kindle version, the Apple's iBookstore, if you have an iPad, for example, you can go there to purchase the EPUB version.
Okay.
But you can get any of the three versions off of my website, xdeskpublishing.com. There's actually some other interesting information on there as well, an entire overview of the Kirtland area with some pictures from the locale that you can look at. But whichever version that they would like, certainly Amazon is easy to get the Kindle version. But XDesk Publishing, my website, you can get any of them as well.
Okay. The other thing that I think I mentioned to you before and that struck me was you included a map of the area in your book. And there's one thing you read about these various cities, but when you see their relation to each other, that's a hugely important area to ufology out there. And it really just struck me when I saw the map. I mean, there's so much going on in that area. Why do you think it is? Is it just the isolation and the ability of the government to hide things from the general public in that isolated area, or were there's...
Yeah, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know whether it's an area with so much going on because there's something else intrinsic or to the area that makes it valuable, or whether because we have all those facilities there, that also has some reason for why there might be so much going on as far as the ufology or UFO sightings is concerned. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if there was a place to be at any given point in time, somewhere between there and probably Phoenix, that part of the country has got, and Nevada area, I guess, has a lot to it. But I don't know. But it is a beautiful area, and of course, it would be very convenient to have things go on in isolated valleys here and there. But yeah, I don't know why exactly that area specifically has so much happening.
Maybe Benowitz was right. Maybe there is an alien base under the Archuleta Mesa. Who knows?
Well, yeah, I mean,
maybe there was. I mean, who knows, really?
It's one of the things that and I'm always a little reticent to say this because I'm sure you know from your experience as well as I do that there are so many different aspects to what people call ufology that it's almost like a free-for-all. I don't necessarily think it should be that way, but when you can't prove anything, like on some of these shows, if there's never any absolute proof, then a lot of people are free to say whatever they want because you can't disprove it. I don't know what I think about an actual underground base, at least of the nature people talk about these days, but I do think Paul Benowitz saw certain things up in that area that clearly indicated, and I described some of what he saw in my book, clearly indicated to me, I'm not going to write off the fact that area seems to have some very interesting things happening. What it is, I don't know, but if you ask me whether I think there's a massive underground base with aliens and running a wild, or whether there was some big battle down there, personally, I have not seen any convincing evidence that anything that massive would be going on. But I'm not going to discount everything either.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. What struck me, though, was here's this fellow, Paul Benowitz, a nice man, a family man, and he does see these lights and these objects landing in a weapons storage area, and he reports it to the Air Force Base. I mean, I think if the Air Force Base had just come out and say, well, thank you, yeah, we did have some experimental aircraft, and we'd appreciate you just keeping it quiet. I think a man of that nature would say, oh, okay, and just let it go at that. Why did they make such a huge deal out of this? Well,
that's a good point. And, of course, keep in mind, one of the reasons that I wanted specifically, and it's been the bane of my existence as far as if a publisher wants to publish this book, fine, but it has to have color pictures.
Oh, okay.
And that's been a big issue because it's rather costly, of course, and unfortunately UFOs don't have the commercial appeal of Stephen King or someone like that. But if you looked at the images, and Paul sent me those images when I was actually giving a talk one time years ago at a MUFON meeting in Dallas, coincidentally, and I told him I wanted to talk about what he had seen and filmed, and he sent me a box that contained those pictures in them. I mean, he sent me several others over the time, but obviously when I opened it up and looked at them, I realized these are not just little lights, as Bill Moore and some other people tried to insinuate. It was very clear that something unusual was going on, and he had gotten some very good pictures of them. And it wasn't until I actually was able to get them into a computer image enhancement program where you can dig down into the brightness and make out some of what's going on in there, which I reproduce in the book, that you'd know, I think, when they went and looked at what he had, and especially they realized he didn't just take a snapshot picture, like a cell phone, whatever back in the day. He had a camera, and he had a good telephoto lens and a telescope, and these images, just the ones he sent me, let alone, I wish I had the film, but it was very clear. Anybody who saw these would know this is something else. This is not just a helicopter or something. And I have an idea or feeling that Paul obviously believed he had something significant, and he told me he called them first because he didn't see the alarms go off. And he was concerned that the Air Force had no clue this was going on. And just for the people who've not had a chance to look at the book yet, this went on over several nights. This was not just a one-night, one-time deal. He happened to be out on his roof. These things would come in after dark, very quickly set down, and stay there sometimes for hours, till the wee hours of the morning. And in one case, as I mentioned in the book, he wrote that he saw what looked like somebody with a flashlight walking around. He could see the bright flashlight playing on the ground or something. So whatever these things were coming and going into an area, and he was concerned after all of this that if there was no response, perhaps the Air Force had no idea. So he called them and wanted to talk to them about what he had on film. And unfortunately, instead of them doing something about, they went after him as well. It seems like to try to quash the whole idea. Anybody to know. And I have a feeling from looking at the dates and times that Paul just wouldn't stay quiet. At some point, he didn't like, or he just kind of became disillusioned with the response he was getting from the Air Force, and had begun to call other people, so go off the reservation, so to speak.
I don't know that I battled the Air Force, but brave guy. You see what happened. Kate Valentine, I was speaking to Chris Lambright on 1160. He is the author of X Descending. We have one question that came in, is why are there no sightings from places like Harvard or Yale? I think there's more to that than just, obviously, they're lit places. People aren't really looking for these things. The night sky is not as dark as it is out in the Southwest. But you bring up a very important philosophical issue, and that is you won't believe what you don't think you should believe. Like the people at the time that Galileo was sighting the 4 moons at Jupiter, they'd look through the telescope, see the moons, and say, no, we don't see them. And I think sometimes scientists that really don't want to get involved with ufology actually do not see UFOs, and that might be part of it. What is your interpretation of that?
Well, I think that plays a big part of it, and in fact, But I think I'm glad you brought this up. It is something I think that it's very important. People need to really begin to think about. I am very interested in this. Have been for a long time. I'm also interested in just about every other unusual scientific venture as well. But I have never seen anything that I think I would tell you was a UFO. But I also realize that, well, it depends upon, it's not just, what is it Sherlock Holmes used to say, you see but you do not observe. It's knowing what to look for. Yeah. I'll give you a beautiful example of why I think Ray Stanford is as successful as he has been. And don't get me wrong, we're not talking somebody who can just go out and put up a camera and take things. He has been in this maybe longer than anybody still alive. Right. And over that time, so we're talking about a lot of years, and he had what it took. He was willing to go at a moment's notice, and like I said, carry that camera with him everywhere. But he has some unusual ability to recognize patterns of some sort or other that's clearly been evidenced recently in the and what's come out about his paleontological, his dinosaur track discoveries in the Washington area. He's now got a fossil that he found in the area around the Baltimore, Maryland area that's in the Smithsonian. And what it became obvious to me when I first began to look at some of what he's got is you have to know how to look. You have to know how to see it that way. Many of these things that are up in the sky, I'm convinced many of these things at times do tend to obscure themselves in ways. And the average person looks up and sees something, what the heck is that? And they go about their business. There are people who now walk around and where Ray is and are finding fossils and tracks in places the experts said there were none. But Ray has an ability to look and see something and check, and it's proven out. But he's shown me things that I've looked at. If you know what those 3D magic pictures where you look at them a certain way and it looks like nothing. Right. But if you let your mind settle and your eyes settle, the picture jumps out. And after that, it becomes much easier. And that's a kind of an analogy to the ability to perceive and look at things and recognize patterns there. I think it can be taught. Anybody can learn, but it does take a little shift of your, of your thinking that to lean towards the idea that I'm going to let my mind see what's there. And a lot of these details jump right out. But I've seen a slab of rock that looked like granite to me. But when someone points out the dinosaur tracks, suddenly they're clear as day.
Yeah.
And obviously now you can go out and find them yourself. That type of a thing, I think, goes toward the idea that people don't expect to see things or don't expect them to be real. And in many cases, it's like, denial without consciously being aware of it, that you just let it go. You don't pay attention. And I think there are things out there that people would see, but either they write them off or it's not what they expect. People expect a shiny little disc to sit there, and it's not always going to present itself that way.
Well, so that also answers another question that Ballast sent in. Why does our government think we can't handle the truth about UFOs when so many other countries report their sightings? But again, it's not just the government. As you said, like a person can pick up these patterns, but if the authoritative figures tell you that they're not there, much as the church at the time told Galileo the moons of Jupiter were not there, that's another aspect to that ability to see patterns, and I think that's what Benowitz and Stanford overcame.
Exactly. I mean, to me, and keep in mind, the individual can do pretty much what he wants, and they may not come down on you or have any interest in you if you're minding your business and just doing it yourself, and there's no concern about it. I have a feeling also it's a matter of somebody's budget. Whatever Paul Benowitz saw out at Kirtland, if somebody had been brought in to explain, somebody's going to be on the hot seat, or somebody's going to have explaining. Maybe there's budget issues. So there may be any number of reasons that, and rightfully so, I do want to qualify this, that many of the people I've spoken with in the Air Force and otherwise, I think are very honest, hardworking people. I don't immediately assume there's something wrong. It may very well be that we're simply trying to learn everything we can, and we don't want to broadcast to everybody else, every other country, what we're doing or what we know. But I think many people have thought about this, and I don't really see any reason for the government per se, whoever it actually is, to come out and tell us anything until they need to. I mean, there's no real reason for them to come out and acknowledge this, as reality right now, because clearly they're not dropping out of the sky, and there's no real reason to do that. And they may be doing things on their own. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they aren't doing some things. They just aren't bothering to tell us what they're doing, like what's going on out at Area 51. We don't need to know yet.
Yeah, just because we pay the bills, there's no reason to tell us.
You would think so. Now, it brings up a point that I think, in fact, you mentioned Robert Bigelow. After thinking a lot about it, if he's got the money and he's got the interest, he's free to go in this country and pursue whatever he wants to pursue. And I think his practical approach, which is once you're convinced there's something to this, if you just want to know the truth, you can sit back and read the newspaper, and sooner or later it'll appear on the front lines, and there you go. But if you want to do something with it, like they say about any business, be first. If you want to be the first one out there, I think that there's some things that could be done. I've even talked to Ray about, if somebody would want to come up and give a grant to do something. There's plenty. What I put on, what Ray's film, the film I show in this book, that was in the book for the reasons that I put it in the book. There are other films out there, and this one is a staggering film. If you got a chance to see some of the enhanced images, which I'm on Ray every day to kind of show those, and he has shown them to other people, but he has some other films that would make your skin crawl, because you can see details in there. You can see certain things going on. There's a lot of things around there, around these images, these objects, that I think the right people would be able to glean something from.
Well,
he may have some of the best pictures outside of wherever the government keeps theirs of anyone that I've ever seen. But I think maybe Bigelow, and deciding to go into space on putting his own money into it, somebody who puts the money into this kind of subject may stand to be first. If maybe there's a more pragmatic approach to ufology than just hoping somebody will tell us.
Well, I certainly agree with you. I think Bigelow had financial interest rather than a philosophical interest in UFOs. And you know what they say about business, there's two people, the quick and the dead. That's true. Kate Valentine here. I was speaking to Chris Lambright. He's the author of X Descending. We're on 1160 WVNJ, and your thoughts, your opinions matter. So please let us know what you think. AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. We'll be right back after a quick break.
If you missed part of today's program or you'd like to hear it again, be sure to subscribe to the Kate Valentine UFO Show podcast. Go to Kate's website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com, and sign up by entering your email address on the homepage. Every week the show will be delivered right to you, so you'll never miss another intriguing, thought-provoking interview with the top names in the UFO field. Sign up today for the Kate Valentine UFO Show podcast at AtlanticCoastUFOs.com.
Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today is Mr. Chris Lambright. He is the author of X Descending, subtitled, and I'll get it for you in 1 second here. I'm sorry, Chris, I just went right off and I forgot it. Well, anyway, it's all about it's about many, many things, but basically it's about how to investigate something right down to the heart of the matter. And you were talking about research and different factors that would sort of get a person interested in whatever it is, whatever question it is they wanted to investigate. And the important thing is to just keep asking questions. Just keep asking questions until you get right down to the heart of the matter. And that's what you did in this book, and that's what was so impressive to me. I think it's really excellent.
Well, I have a thought that I keep in mind, and which is, if all you know is what someone else told you, you don't really know anything.
Well, it's true.
It's kind of why I have the chapter in there about knowledge and belief. The point is, if you pick up the phone and call, if you go ask and find out for yourself, then at least you've gone as far as you can to get straight to the source. So whatever anyone else tells you, you have to weigh in what their point of view is. And it brings to mind something that I think I'd like to mention, that I had a review on Amazon by a gentleman who seemed to think the book was a little self-indulgent, and I realized, well, people need to understand this. If you're interested in Nibiru, or if the face on Mars, or any of those other kinds of what a lot of people might consider fringe topics, this probably isn't the book for you. I mean, I'm not saying those aren't interesting subjects, but just to clarify, I'm writing specifically about 2 films that focus on the technology. This is not a catch-all book with every other subject on it and wide-ranging speculation about different things. This is a very specific book about the technology, because if you get to the technology, you're going to have to confront who is flying them, who's doing what, and that opens the door to a wide range of possibilities, because you can't escape the idea of, once you've proven that to yourself that what Ray Stanford got on film is something we do not have the capability to have built back then, you have to ask the question, well, then who did? Where did they come from?
That is exactly the point. Your book was focused, and that was really excellent. We did have a question that came in from Earl. He was wondering if the Benowitz's family has granted you access to Paul's evidence since his passing.
No, they have not. I wrote them several times. I called his sons. I wish that they would. It's painful to not have that. I wish I had done more. But I have the information that Paul sent me, a lot of handwritten information which I used specifically in the book, and the photos that he gave me a long time ago. And I did at one point write to Ms. Benowitz and ask her if she or her son still have the footage that he has, to please lock it away.
Yeah.
If they wanted to call me and let me do something with it, I mean, that would be... I just pray that is kept safe somewhere, and that at some point someone has an opportunity now with computer technology and Photoshop and all of that to enhance that. But I kind of agreed with Greg Bishop that they do have the right to be left alone.
Yeah.
Unless they make that inroad, there's limited what you can do.
And they saw what they did to him, so I can see why the family backed off. Deb also wrote in. She was wondering what the reaction to your book has been.
Well, I've had good reaction from people who've read it, from other other places and other interviews that I've had. I've had emails from people around the world, even as far away as Belgium and whatnot. I am surprised in some cases that certain questions aren't asked. Specifically, the situation that I came across when I began to confront Richard Doty over some of his indications where he had been in the past. Was he in some way affiliated with CIA? He and John Lear both had, the Appendix A in that book, which was one that somebody had told me if I got in trouble, that's probably where it would come from. but it raises the question of who is actually involved and who was behind the Paul Benowitz issue. The case of Lake Mirabeau of the Air Force Research Lab. Those are people should call and confront them, get science to call to account. That's my opinion. My feeling is that there's a lot more information with, like I said, this book names names. There are names of people. You should get your congressman to go and call these people in and ask them questions about some of this. Who's done what? Who knows what? Well,
that was another thing you brought up, too, is who decides this? Who has in a position to say, this we'll release to the general public and this we won't? And, it is a rather aggravating situation.
I agree. I mean, on the one hand, it's aggravating if you're waiting for somebody else to tell you something. Like I say, you could go stand at the gate to Area 51 and demand that they tell you the truth and see how far you get with that.
Well,
same thing with the White House. But at the same point in time, I'm, to this day, grateful that people like Bigelow and others are actually pursuing a commercial space program. I think there are people like I told Ray the other day, I said, even Nikola Tesla needed, I think it was Westinghouse, somebody with some connections to come in and put some money back in, and here we all now benefit from this. But it took both sides of that equation. No one can just do it themselves. But if somebody would come and license some of Ray's material and let us get those things digitized and analyzed, who knows what the benefits may come in the future. But it takes somebody with some vision, the willingness to do that.
There was a question that came in from Chris. He was wondering if you believe that there are other beings in our universe. I guess that's just a personal belief, whether you have it or not, or you don't care to.
Well,
it's a belief.
You might answer that two ways. In our universe, I think it would be exceedingly, centrist to believe that on this little planet out here in the outskirts of our galaxy, that this is the only place life could have evolved. If you're going to believe it can happen out here, you have to accept the fact that it could likely happen elsewhere. And if it's happened elsewhere, and this universe has been around as long as it has, what's the likelihood that some other group might be far ahead of us and have a way to get here and that we don't yet? You have to allow that as well. Do I think there's a likelihood that whoever they are, somebody is getting here? At this stage, I'd have to come down and say yes, if only because in my last 20, 25 years of studying what Ray got on film, the film I put in my book, and I found written, reports, documentation elsewhere by experts who state we don't have that technology yet. And if we don't have that technology yet, and in most cases, keep in mind, there's a budget for next year's research and development, so you have to show them what you built with last year's budget. At some point, if this was made 20 or 30 years ago, I think we'd see more of it out there somewhere, because they would have to justify more budget money. So at some point it goes out, like the stealth aircraft. Sooner or later you see it, because they're on to the next best thing, So in this particular case, though, I don't think if you look at what Ray filmed and some of the other things he's got on film, I don't think you can easily come down ever and say that this is all us. Well, it must be someone else.
Who knows what, but I have to agree with you. Steve said, can either of these films be seen?
The Benowitz film, I don't have. Like I said, I hope his family might still have it, or somebody has those films somewhere. I don't know of anybody who has those. Ray has his film. Like I said, if we could find a way to get them digitized, we could play them forward and backward and see them. He has got any number of infinite, slides made out of different frames of those films. Most of those films, he keeps them locked in a very secure place and tries to not scratch them, because it's not digital. It's 8mm or 16mm film that he's very careful about. But it is something that even I've gone back and taken series of the frames and put them together to make an animation so you can watch, and boy, there are things you can see. So Ray has the film, but whether he'll play it, I think he's fair and open to show it to anybody. I mean, to show what he has to anybody who wants to come see. And he's given several talks in Arizona and a few other places, even overseas, in which he's shown some of the images from these films. But I got yelled at a little bit by people in my first interview who said, "Why don't you just put it on YouTube?" I'm like, YouTube, if people consider that the arbiter of truth these days or something, and unfortunately, it just gets lambasted by anonymous people.
Oh, yeah.
But it's there, and I'm on Ray all the time to digitize this stuff so we can actually do something with it.
Well, Chris, I'm sorry, but we only have this 1 hour to go over what had to have been years of research and deep investigation on your part.
Well, we can do it again whenever you want.
Okay, cool. Because, I want to urge our listeners to obtain a copy of your work, X Descending, because it's they have to understand what they may be up against as ufologists, and not to be, as you warn, to be naive. So again, if you could just tell us how to get a copy of that book.
You can go to Amazon for a Kindle version, or Apple's iBookstore for an EPUB version. But if you go to my website, xdeskpublishing.com, you can buy any of the three versions, Kindle, EPUB, or even a PDF version, if you like. And I just encourage people to please read it. I don't necessarily care where you get it. Just please read it, because I want the information out there. And for you, you should look up Ray. He can give you a lot more details about what's in the film and what he knows and some things I wrote about. So.
Okay, I actually will. Yeah, it was great. I just can't encourage our audience enough, really. It's a whole new way of looking at things, too. It's a different tone to your book. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Call me anytime. We'll talk again.
Okie doke.
Thanks. Have a great afternoon.
You too. And as always, my sincere thanks to both Bill and Dave, to our sponsors, most of all to you, our listeners. You can hear this show again on our podcast or on YouTube, or even again this Sunday at 4 and 1160. So tune in next week. Chris Holly will be back with us with breaking UFO news in the neighborhood. So until then, have a great weekend. We'll see you next Friday at 1. And until then, you know the drill. Keep your eye on the sky. Bye.